Ta-da. Okay, so if you weren't on the July monthly networking call that we do, you may not know what the Top 100 Rural County Project is. And it is something that we started to look at how that we could build power in rural communities and counties across the country heading into 2024 and this really important election cycle that we have coming up. So what I began to do was take a look at some data, lots and lots of data, in order to give us a roadmap and a strategy on how to move forward. So what I'm going to do is share with you my screen. Hopefully, if it pops up and lets me, it's telling me to open it up. Okay, got it. And then I'm going to kind of walk you through this. So what we did was we took a look at the states across the country where they were either swing states, key states, or states where, you know, we could make gains or significant progress coming into the next election cycle. So the focus here is going to be on power building. Not every county that that we considered that we got data for made the top 100 list, but those counties are still important on a state level, whether that, you know, maybe not for the national campaign and maybe not for a specific campaign, but it's overall, they're still all important. So this is a short-term piece of a long-term strategy. The Republican and conservative agenda has been very good at having a long-term strategy. So we had 17 states, and we're going to talk about Texas. So one of the things that we did in Texas is I gathered data from the 2020 presidential election, 2020 House, 2020 Senate, and then 2022 gubernatorial and House races, and then your voter registration numbers, turnout numbers, population, and then percent rural. So lots of data that we're going to take a look at and kind of put it together in a way that makes sense. And also gives you workable strategy that will help hopefully with organizing, funding, and building momentum for progressive issues and policies in rural communities in Texas. So the way that we started doing this, it's a data-driven analysis. We didn't go, ooh, who do we want to get out in Texas? Nope. What we looked at is where does the data lead us to? So we looked at, first we had to identify the states. Oh, yeah. First, we had to identify the states. Then we looked at the counties within those states that had margins that were 10% or less, right? And then we cross-referenced those counties across elections. So if I had a county that showed up in the presidential data, I had to look to see if that same county was showing up in the House data and the Senate data and the gubernatorial data. And if it did, were we getting the same types of margin or were there significant differences? Was one race, you know, one Democratic and the other one run Republican? And why might that be? Different things like that. And so once we cross-referenced them, then we took the ones that showed up the most consistently that had a margin of 10% or less. So we identified the top or the repetitive counties. And then we added in population and percent rural, and then common districts and seats to determine where we could find power, if that makes sense. So when you look at the 2020 presidential data, this is like the pretty version that you guys are going to get in your email after this. I'm going to show you my working document as well, so you can kind of see what this looked like as we went into it. But these are the counties that we identified as being able to make power and significant gains coming into the 2024 election. So as you can see, there are 7 on this list. Now, just because there are 7 that are on here for the data, it doesn't mean that those 7, that they all made it to the top 100. And so I'm going to show you kind of what that looks like over here. Give me one second. Here we go, Texas. So actually, so see, there's 7 here, but 4 made the list. So let me show you. Okay, awesome. So we had Brewster, Culberson, Frio, Jim Wells, Kleberg, LaSalle, and Zapata, right? But actually we only had Brewster, Frio, Kleberg, and LaSalle that made it onto the top 100 for power building. And the reason why is, and I'm going to walk you through this as we got there, but these 4 had something in common that the others did not. Does that mean that we don't want to focus on the other 3? Not at all. It means that when we look at where we want to put the majority of our resources, we want to focus on those ones where we can create some power structure that we can hold on to. That's something that came up a lot in the conversation. So we had another exit interview project from January to April of this year before we did the top 100 project. And that was for ruralorganizing.org. This is ruralvote.org. But with the exit interview project, I talked to and I interviewed 50 organizers across the country. And we talked about what did we see in, the last, couple of election cycles, and, how could we leverage that information, and what did we need to do as organizers and philanthropic organizations and, parties and institutions and legislators. So we took that data and also looked at where we could make change. So let me show you what the raw data looked like. I'm going to share my screen with you. Emily's on. Okay, so looking at the raw data, I'm going to come back over here to Texas. And as you can see, when we started to put together the data, I'm looking at presidential wins, gubernatorial wins, Senate wins, House races, right? And then the population information that we talked about before. And then I looked at voter turnout. So for the voting data, when we look at Brewster, Culbertson, Frio, Jim Wells, Clayburgh, LaSalle, and Zapata, I'm not sure how you say it. We looked at the population and then the voter registration numbers and the percent that was registered to vote in those counties. Why is this important to you? Well, you can look at Frio, only 47, almost 48% of the people there are registered to vote. Whereas if I turn around and I look at Brewster, right, 77, almost 76% are registered to vote. This data helps you look at, okay, is it more about turning out the vote, or is it about getting people registered to vote, or is it a combination of both of those things? Right now, I'm in Tennessee. I was born and raised here in rural Tennessee. We are a state that about 38% of the population that's registered to vote actually votes, right? So we're not, the people that are in the majority are not, they are not the people who represent the majority, because the majority of Tennesseans aren't voting. So you want to be able to take this data and look at your individual counties or the places where you're going to organize or where your party needs to be organizing and say, all right, where do we need to put our efforts when it comes to being boots on the ground? The other piece of this, and we're going to look at it in just a second, is what are the voting registration trends in your counties and in your state? But all of that comes into play. We know that elections that happen on off years are going to have lower voter turnout. But even in the presidential population, I want you to look at this. Even in the presidential race in 2020, we had 27, 28% to just shy of 50% of the people voting. What is happening in rural Texas, where less than 50% of the people in rural communities are heading to the polls to elect their president? And if you look, it's even worse when it comes to their governor. And so one of the things one of the conversations that I would be having with people in your community and in these rural towns, especially when it comes to the governor, is many people, what I have found is many people don't understand what a governor is and the role that it plays in your everyday life. So I explain it to people the way that I explained it to he's now 9, but at the time he was my 8-year-old grandson. And so when I told him, because last year I worked on the Stacey Abrams campaign. And so I said, listen, Tutu isn't going to be as available because I'm working for, this woman that we want to be the next governor of Georgia. And he said, what's a governor, Tutu? And I said, you know how we have the president of the United States, and so he's the president over all of our states? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, a governor is like the president of an individual state. And he was like, oh, so he told all his friends, my Tutu's working for the next president of Georgia. But that's the way to make people understand these differences in our candidates and the roles that they play in our lives on a regular basis. So we focus a lot on presidential elections and not on our state elections, which are really important as well. So when you look at the voter turnout in these areas, it's a concern that in rural Texas, voter turnout is ridiculously low. And 50%, it's under 50% in every single election. So that would be the first thing that I would be looking at if I were working on these counties in Texas, is how do we get the voter turnout? What has disengaged people who are registered to vote and gotten to them to the place where they are not participating in the process? And so one of the ways to have that conversation is, hey, listen, there was something at some point in time that made you register to vote, right? At some point, you had an interest in your elected officials and participating in the process. What has got you disengaged? And then listen for those talking points and those key points. I think what we are seeing a lot right now is politic fatigue. And that's thanks to a lot of different factors over, the last several years. But taking that into consideration, we need to figure out, how do we get people re-energized and ready to take on this? And that means organizers as well. So coming back to the data, if I look at the presidential data, the way that this started is, I'm going to show you. So let's just say that I started here, and I would pull up a state map and very easily be able to identify margins that were 10% or less, right? Based on the coloring and the shading. And then I would actually pull the full result. So even though I could see by shading, I laid my eyes on every single county in Texas to really take a look and see, where do we have these margins and are they trending? And so it started out a very manual process where I would take a look and I would say, all right, so nothing on page 1, I would go to page 2, right? Nothing on page 2, I would go to page 3. And then be like, oh, okay, so I see Brewster County is like less than 7%. Less than 5% margin. So I would write that county down, and I would do that for every page for the presidential election. And then I would turn around and go to the Senate and do the same process, and then go to the House and do the same process. So it was painstaking work. But if you have interns, volunteers, people that can help you stay on top of the data, it is well worth it, because this is the information that you can take to the people that have the money and the bodies, or the money to fund the bodies, to get people out in these areas to make a difference. And so once I did that and I narrowed it down and said, okay, so these are the 7 counties that repeatedly show up with margins, with which margins that are slimmer than others, that are 10% or less. Then I went to the actual Secretary of State's website and compared that data, because your major, like Politico and CNN, they're only going to show you Republican and Democrat. They're not going to show you the other votes. And why are the other votes important? Well, they're really important because if I go back and look at this spreadsheet, so what we took a look at is, let's just take Kleberg, for example. So the margin between these two, right, was less than 200. Okay, it was about 190 votes separated these two, and made a Republican win. Well, 126 people voted for the other candidate. What would happen had we won those other votes? And why am I focusing on that? Because these are people who are registered to vote. These are people who are already participating in the process. So that's 2 hurdles I don't have to overcome if I want to win this county, right? I don't have to get them registered and I don't have to convince them that voting is important, because they already believe in those 2 things and are doing them. So if we were able to win those 126, we would only need 64 more votes to flip that county. It's doable. It's doable, right? And so you want to be able to take this data and say, holy crap, same thing. Now, that was flipping it for progressive values. Well, take a look at Culbertson. We won that county by the skin of our teeth, right? By the skin of our teeth. So we need to be paying attention in this county, because we need to be able to hold on to it, not lose it, not have it be flipped on us, which is just as important, right? So it's not just about building power by flipping counties, but it's building power by maintaining the leads that we already have when it comes to progressive policy. And so this is the reason why it's important to see who are the other votes that are already voting, because they're already invested in the act of, democracy. And so we want to identify those people, and you do that for each of the elections. The other thing that you're looking at is to say, okay, Culbertson has a population of 21, almost 2,200 people. Kleberg has a population of 31,000. Very, very different. So counties that had a population of less than 5,000 did not make our top 100 list. Why? Because again, we're looking at power building, and that means, where do we spend money for our resources? Does it make sense? Does it make sense to spend $10,000 in Culbertson or to put that money into Kleberg, right? And how can we still impact Culbertson while we move the needle forward in Kleberg? And so this helps you figure out where your resources need to go and to what degree do we need to spend money in those areas? Do we need to be knocking on doors versus yard signs versus mailers versus social media, radio, television? You know, where, how and where do we need to be reaching these people? And so looking at population also matters. So think about the things that we've talked about so far that are important to this process. Looking at the individual results for these counties from one state to the next, looking at the percentage of people that are registered to vote to see if we need to have a voter registration drive, looking at the people who are registered to vote but are not voting to see how we get them re-engaged in the voting process, looking at the places where we have margins, where we need to maintain the gains that we've made, and places where we can flip. All of that is information that you can now take to funders and people who help finance, because like it or not, right, we need money to make these things happen. But with this data, you can say, hey, did you realize just how close it is? Because a lot of times people don't realize just how close some of these races are. And so the other thing to take a look at is, now I want you to look at the difference from, say, for example, this Senate 2020 race versus the gubernatorial race or these two House races. Look at the difference in the total number of votes. For the House race in 2020, it was 4,769. 1,000 less people voted in 2022, but almost the same number of people were registered. Again, why are people disengaging from the process? If you look at this all the way across the board, every single one of these counties, fewer people voted. All the way across the board. Those are things. So what is the data trying to tell us, right? People are still registered, but they're just checking out the process, right? Or is there a decline in registration, which we're going to look at that as well. And so once you start to look at that, then you can say, okay, what do I do with this data? And so for the House, this is different than Georgia. So like Georgia, we identified counties based on the presidential race and the Senate races, because the counties that we could make gains in did not all have an impact on a particular seat in the House or seats in the House. Well, in Texas, that's very different, right? In Texas, 4 out of our 7 were for District 23. 2 were 34 and 1 was 28. So when we look at where we build power in Texas, right, it's absolutely these 4 that share the same House district seat as 23. So we didn't look at the House map and say, ooh, who do we want to get rid of? Nope. We let the data drive us to where we can flip a seat or take a seat or make strides in that seat. So again, it's letting the data tell you where you need to focus your energy and what races can be affected. So what does that mean for Texas? So if I look at the House District 23, that race, it was 56% Republican, 38 point, almost 39% Democratic. It was a 17.1% difference. The actual vote difference was 35,702. There were 12,137 people they didn't vote in these counties, just these 4 counties. So if you could get those 12,137 people that are already registered but not voting, that would account for 33% of the votes needed to flip that House. And that's just from the smaller rural counties in that district. So that's how you represent power. That's how you go to your local, state, and national parties and say, this is why you should invest in rural Texas, because we can account for 1/3 of the votes needed to flip this seat in the House. That's a much more powerful argument than saying we feel left out and you don't give us any money and oh, woe is me, right? So you want to be able to take this data and use it effectively to get the tools and the resources that you need to actually make those gains, right? Now, once you get back and you see that, then you start to take a look at your voter registration information. And so what I did was I pulled 2020, 2022, and then 2023 to take a look at like where are we at currently and what are the trends. So as you can see, between 2020 and 2022, we lost almost 2% of the people that were registered to vote in these 7 counties, right? 2%. What you'll also see is in 2023, you will have about 5,000 votes of people that are registered but are inactive. 5,000 votes. Think about that for a second. Now go back up here to some of these numbers that we were looking at, and I'll just stay right here in 2022. All right, so 172 needed if you get these other votes. So if I put these two numbers together, that's going to give me roughly 400 votes. I'm just rounding up, folks, right? Because I don't particularly care for math a whole lot, but 400 votes. Well, there's 896 available, right? If I look at these two numbers together, right, or the difference in the votes, you're talking what, 150 votes? Well, there's 37 available, right? So that's a fifth, 20% of what you need. See how you can take the data and say, holy crap, this is what, less than 100 votes that's needed. Well, there's 454 people that are registered that are not voting. This is what's available to you. These are people already in the system that you can actually pull and say, okay, how do we use this information in our counties to make the gains that we want to make? So I'm going to take you back over here to the spreadsheet, but I mean to the presentation. But before I do that, I'm going to open it up to see if anybody has any questions about the data, the process, or anything else with regard to these rural Texas counties that we've covered so far. Any questions, Andrea or Emily? And if not, that's okay. In Georgia, one of the questions that came up, you said none here. Okay, so in Georgia, one of the questions that came up was, okay, how do we take this information and have it correlate to boots on the ground, right? No questions, Emily. Okay, and so of course, that's going to matter based on geography and a few other things. And so, you know, when you look at this, and so like for me, I'm not familiar like with the geographics of these counties, but I can tell you that from where I'm at in Northeast Tennessee, organizing in Hawkins County is going to look drastically different than organizing in Johnson County or Sullivan County to Johnson County, because the landscape is going to be that much different. Things that we talked about is, especially in rural communities like this, is looking at where you can get the most bang for your buck, so to speak. So high school football games, farmers markets, flea markets, festivals, you know, we have strawberry festivals, peach festivals, just depends upon where you are, right? But looking at those places where people are already gathering. But the other thing to remember is that looking at the places where those people are gathering is how do you get them, because nobody comes to the high school football game wanting to talk about politics, right? If they do, I don't know, I'd be worried about them. So the question becomes, how do you engage those people in conversations at those moments and make the most of the opportunity that you have? And so the number one thing is going to be your authenticity, right? There has to be buy-in and you have to believe the things that you are saying. Number two, everything comes back to one of 4 issues. I call them the 4 pillars. So I don't care what the issue is, it comes back to either housing, healthcare, education, or economic stability. It's one of those 4 every single time. So you have to start to look at your particular county and say, what are the major issues here? And so like in the last session, somebody said, well, the issue is cannabis, right? Legalizing cannabis would be huge for young people here, and that's the issue. And I said, well, okay, so has there been an issue campaign around cannabis? He said, well, no, not really. And I said, well, you're missing it, right? Because that is something that people will get motivated and get behind. So in these communities, you want to be looking for your community influencers. You want to be looking at your legislators. You want to be looking at those people who can tell you what are the major issues and what would get people motivated. So like where I am, it's healthcare, right? Undisputed, it's healthcare. And so I know that if I can take that healthcare issue and the campaign around improving our healthcare here, and I can make that translate into political campaigns and candidates and policy, I'm going to win over people who normally would not be voting in this direction because it is tied to an issue that has significant importance to them. So those are the things that you want to be doing with this data, is looking at places where you can get the most bang for your buck, knowing what the issues are in that community, knowing how to correlate and connect the issues to your political, whether it's a particular candidate or party. And then that may also help you choose who's going to run, right? And who's actually willing to run. A lot of people aren't willing to run because they don't believe that they can make a difference, or they don't believe that, they can be impactful. And so all of this data it can be the thing that positions you to recruit the right way, to get the funding that you need, to get the organizers that you need, and to build off of the issues that are relevant to the people in your community. So all of those things are a solid win. Okay. And then lastly, here's what I'm going to show you is the, here we go. So the last part of this is looking at your population and your voting data. So in every single one of these counties, like Kleberg, it's 31,000, but almost 20% of it is rural, right? And the state population rank. So when I'm talking to individuals, to potential funders or philanthropic organizations and people like that, I can talk to them about the types of people that we are reaching and why they are relevant to the goal that we have and to the initiative that we are attempting to push. We already looked a little bit at the voting data in terms of losses and gains, and having that impact us in the way that we choose to put our initiatives together. So right now, if I were working these communities, I would start fourth quarter 2023 dialed in to voter registration. That would be my big push for this fourth quarter and the first quarter. And as I bled into that first quarter, and y'all are like, wait, the election's a year away. I don't care. We can't wait until the last minute. Starting first quarter 2024, the messaging would be about the importance of turning out the vote. I think that people would be shocked in these communities to know that 25% or 32% of the people are actually voting for their president or for their governor or for their senator and for their house. Educate to engage, right? That is a huge part of how you make this data relevant to your community, to funders, for organizers, and people like yourselves who join this call and who are watching this recording later. It's figuring out how do you capitalize on this data. So I'll give you another example. The gentleman on the last call that was talking about cannabis being the issue. I said, so here's what I would do. If it were me, I would be looking at states with counties. I would look at states that where cannabis had been made legal. And then I would be looking at counties with a similar demographic to the county that I'm in. And then I would contact those officials, and I would be looking at what happened with the dollars and the revenue that came to that county from cannabis sales. I'll be talking to business owners, and using that information for my county, right? It's, hey, look what's already been done. People love a blueprint. People love a roadmap to success. So being able to demonstrate that and then tying it to a candidate or a policy or an objective helps you move the needle forward and make gains across the board. So what's going to happen after this? You're going to get an email from me. And in that email, you're going to get a recording of the deep dive presentation. You're going to get the PDF that I'm showing you as well, a link to the Top Rural 100 Counties project, as well as the Exit Interview project, and then an invitation to join our monthly networking call. So we get together. I hear organizers all the time in rural communities talking about, we don't collaborate enough, and we don't get together enough, and man, we should do that. Well, we are doing that on the fourth Thursday of every month at 2:00. And we have different folks who come in to speak. This month, it's going to be Afton, who is part of the organization, but she has been an advocate and an activist for years in the state of Tennessee. And she's running for state house and just won her primary. So we're going to talk about, state politics and how to use that to collaborate and to unify as we head into 2024. But in addition to that, we have different organizers, different leaders across the state who join us on those calls. So come back next Thursday at 2:00 and invite your friends, right? You're also going to get this new project that we just started. And I'm going to share that with you right now. So we started working on counties that do not have representation from the Democratic Party. Okay. And why is that important? Well, so if you look at Texas, I just want you to see that there are 56 counties in Texas that do not have a designated leader from the Democratic Party. Does that number surprise you at all? Because it shocked the bejesus out of me. So you start to look at, well, why is that? And what would happen if we did have representation there? And it doesn't necessarily have to be party representation, but progressive representation, right? Who are the influencers there? Who can be there that could be elevated into that position of, relevance and influence and pushing the needle forward in those communities? There are 56 of them that matter. And this is the way that they voted in the presidential election, right? So I've got all of this data that is also going to come to you in an email that follows up from this particular deep dive. So that'll be the next thing that comes along and follows up with this. So I'm going to quit talking for a second just to see if anybody else has any comments, questions, concerns, anything about either what's coming next or the information that I've already shared with you. Anything at all? You guys are my quiet group, which is perfectly okay. Going once. Oh, go ahead.
I do have a question. The data, where were your sources of the data that it was retrieved from? Did y'all use VAN or the census data?
Oh yeah. So for percent rural, we used the census data. For percent rural and population came from census data. For the vote information, it was done in two stages. So the very first stage was to just pick whether it be Politico or CNN and just get the initial numbers for the states so that we can identify the less than 10% margin and kind of find the repetitive counties that were showing up in each of those races. And then after that, it was the Secretary of State's website. So literally, I'm not sure if you were on when I talked about that piece of it, Emily, but I'll show you. So once I got so I literally went through every single county to identify where we had a less than 10% margin and did it for all of the races. So presidential race from 2020, Senate race, House race for 2020, 2022 gubernatorial and House races as well. And then once I got those numbers and identified the counties that kept showing up in the majority of those races with a 10% margin or less, then I came over to the Secretary of State's website. And so if you look, you can get the voter registration figures from 1991 to present, as well as the election results. And so I literally went in and then took, because all you get from those other websites is, the two-party system, but you need to also know when it comes to the other votes, because that's how you can determine the people who are already actively engaged in the process. So it was a multi-tiered process, but that's where the data came from.
That makes sense. And sorry if I missed it. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. It's a lot. It's funny because people are like, oh, you must love data. No, I don't. I hate it. The only time I love data is when it helps me get the task done. So for me, the task is for us to be able to move the needle forward. Somebody asked in the last call, well, how does the strategy differ if it's not a particular party? It doesn't. It's about policy. It's about progress. For me, it's about humanitarian or human based issues. How do we make our communities better? And I look at the policies that are built to do that, right? And for the majority of people and not, the top 1, 2, or 5%. And so when I look at that, the strategy is the same. And that's how you take the information in the policy, is you can just avoid trigger words. So like when I talk to people about Medicare for all, I don't ever say that to them, especially not here. I'm in rural Northeast Tennessee, right? That's a conversation that I will lose every time because it's a trigger word, right? That's socialist healthcare. But if I say to people, let me ask you a question. If you had to pay $1 every single month to live in the state of Tennessee, no matter if you voted, didn't vote, what you ate, didn't eat, if you had to pay $1 every single month to live in the state of Tennessee, and you had to give it to the federal government, and I said to you, well, listen, if you join my club, now joining my club doesn't mean you do anything different. It's not going to cost you anything more. You don't have to give any more than your dollar. But if you join my club, I'll give you 90 cents of every dollar back. Would you join my club? And they all go, of course. Like, what? Why wouldn't I want to get 90% of my money back? And I said, well, that's Medicare for all. Because you pay into the system, whether you use it or not. And the people go, oh, right? So it's, again, knowing where you are and how to take policy, take the trigger words out of it, and communicate it in a way that the people you're speaking to can receive the information that you're sharing with them, right? It's not about being right. It's about being heard. Any other questions before we wrap it up? Or comments? Nope. Okay. Well,
If
yeah.
sorry again, if I run into like any questions once I like do a deeper dive into this, how could I reach you?
Yeah, so you can email me. When you get the email from me, you can contact me via the email. And I'm going to be getting a different one as well, but this is my email currently. Whoops, that's .com. Ignore my typo. Good Lord, I can't type, Emily. Okay, that is me. And you can also join our monthly networking calls, because we discuss a lot of this. And so I'm actually excited for those conversations as people who are joining these deep dives, and we start to talk about overall strategies in rural communities, because they're going to be virtually the same with just a few nuances that resonate with where you are specifically, but the overall gist is going to be the same. And so I'm excited about those conversations. But yeah, you can always email me, join our monthly networking calls, and that sort of thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. All right, that is it. That's all I've got for you guys. I am going to stop recording now, and then just be on the lookout for the follow-up email. And if you haven't registered for the monthly networking call that is next Thursday at 2 p.m., make sure that you do that. It's in the last email that I sent you, and it will be in the next one that I send. So thanks again for coming. Bye-bye.